Okay, so let me start out by asking Lorenzo. You sound like you've been in Australia a long time. Is it your life or sort
Okay,
of?
my 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 paternal ancestor came on the Warby line, came to Australia in 1793. He was a convict.
Okay,
He came on the first ship that wasn't in a fleet, because we had a first fleet, second fleet, third fleet. The first fleet that started the Australia as it became to the Port Jackson colony, which became Sydney, was the largest European fleet to enter the Pacific up to that time. It's because it was, from memory, 11 ships. And they settled the colony, and Australia sort of grew from there. Australia is divided between those states which were convict colonies and those states which were free settling from the start.
mhm.
So my paternal line, they were convicts. My maternal line came out, my mother's line came out in the 1850s. They were from Provence, and they came out in the gold rush. So between convict ancestors and gold rush ancestors, I'm a complete cliche of Australian history and ancestry.
Okay, and what other countries have you visited?
I'm not much of a traveller. So I've been to the United States, I've been to England, I've been to Malta, I've been to Italy, I've been to Ukraine, and I've been to Russia.
Okay,
And a brief
and
stopover in Japan,
okay,
and a brief stopover in Singapore.
and what's your academic background?
Oh, I have no higher degree. I have no master's. I have no PhD. So I did a what we would call a double honours in history and philosophy at Sydney University. I did a diploma of education there, which have since discovered is not in fact a degree. It's a qualification, but not a degree. I did a graduate diploma in economics at ANU.
Okay, so that's Australia. What is AU? Just to clarify.
Australian National University.
Okay, and and then what field did you go into?
Oh,
Out
the
of
public service, as one does. So I was qualified to be a teacher, but I was on the cusp. They got rid of the bond that you had to go out and teach if you're on a teacher scholarship the year before I got my teacher scholarship. And they didn't think to cut the rate until the year after I got my teacher scholarship. So I was in that little cusp point where the scholarship was worth as much as it had been, but the obligations had gone away. So I went into the public service, and I ended up in an economic policy area, and then I spent 5 years in our parliamentary research service, which is the equivalent of your congressional research service.
Okay. And what about after that?
Well, I went into a couple of think tanks, and then I ended up doing what I'm now doing, which is putting on medieval and ancient days for schools. And I own half the business. It's not a very big business, but I own half the business.
Okay. And it seems like you've been following American bloggers for a while. Am I right?
That's correct. Yes. So I used to be a very avid reader of Scott Sumner's blog, but then it became Trump all the time, and I was bored with Trump, so I stopped reading him anywhere as often. And I also, about the same time, I got a publisher's contract to write a book on marriage, which was originally aimed, because we had a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. It was really aimed at the same-sex marriage issue.
Sorry, at what marriages?
Same-sex marriage.
Okay,
So we
yes.
had a plebiscite in Australia about it. Okay, not a
Right.
not a proper referendum, but a plebiscite where the voters were asked by postal vote, right? And so that was before that. I rapidly came to the conclusion that the world did not need another book on same-sex marriage. So I began to dive much more seriously into the general history of our marriage, and then I began to dive much more seriously into the evolutionary anthropology and the evolutionary primatology and biology, helped by the fact that Heather Heying and Brett Weinstein were providing what was basically a graduate level seminar on evolutionary theory for free on the internet if you follow their Dark Horse podcast. And so that book is about half written, but it also began to really change the way I looked at social patterns. And that led to a sort of what was essentially a brain dump, where a whole lot of issues which I've been thinking about for a long time came together. And I wrote this really long piece called Worship in the Future. And my friend Helen Dale suggested that we turn it into individual essays and serialize it on her Substack, which is what's become the Worshipping the Future essay series on Substack. And the plan very much is to, when that's completed, to turn it into a book.
Okay.
So,
and what would you say is your main motivation for that series?
deep frustration about the direction of Western civilization.
Okay. Yeah, it's, in a way, it's sort of a well-plowed field. How would you differentiate yourself from, let's say, a James Lindsay, or, yeah, let's start with James Lindsay. How would you differentiate?
Okay. Yeah, James's great at service is he, to be blunt, he reads all this crap. I've only read bits of the crap, right? And the great thing about James is you can listen to him read and explain this crap in your car as you're driving to, I don't know, a school, for example. So that's not my angle, although I do riff off his work. You'll see there's quite a few links to James Lindsay's podcasts in my essays. My angle is, what are the underlying social patterns which are driving this, right? What's the status strategies? What are the social level strategies? How does this connect with how bureaucracies work? How does this connect to how the modern media landscape works? So it's very much about the underlying social patterns and why they are coming out in the ways and manifesting in the ways they are. I'm taking an evolutionary lens to that.
And do you follow any of the sort of neo James Burnham stuff? Is that name familiar to you?
Yes, I do a bit. So Michael Lind, for example. And I find the talking about the professional managerial class, I completely understand, and I think it's important. But because I'm always thinking in terms of historical examples and what's this like, to quote Neil Ferguson the good, not Neil Ferguson the disgrace. What's this like? And so that's why I sort of keep coming back to the Christianization of the Roman Empire, because one of my arguments is that we're at the end of a civilizational cycle that began with the Christianization of the Roman Empire and continued for about 16 centuries and essentially came apart in the sexual revolution, where the Christian normative language was essentially abolished. I mean, nobody talks, not even Christians really, nobody talks in the language of virginity and chastity anymore. But that was a dominant moral language for centuries in the West, and it's just disappeared into the ether.
Yeah, the suddenness of the sexual revolution, I think, is something that's not well appreciated. You could go, I think, with about a 10-year window where premarital sex is taboo. I mean, people did it, but it was, regarded
normatively
as bad.
Frowned on.
And at the end of that, about that 10-year window, it's like the norm. It's like, how would you, why would you not? So
yes, exactly.
Very rapid. What do you think? Did that impress you also? Just the rapidity
yes,
of it?
Absolutely. Yes. The language of 1955 and the language of 1965 is very different. And the language of 1975 is,
yeah.
The connection is hard to see. It seems to be completely new language about sex and morality and so forth. So you're right. I mean, the suddenness is really, really striking.
Okay, and you sort of, I mean, different people trace sort of the current thing or whatever will to various things. I mean, Christopher Rufo just, he wants to throw it all on Herbert Marcuse and the continental, critical theorists. I think Lindsay does too, but you want to go more on the cultural norms explanations?
Yeah, my point is, look, I like Bishop Barron's description of wokery as the popularization of critical theory. I think it's a rather nice description, actually. But my point is, okay, yes, all true, but why did that resonate in the way it did, right? Obviously, partly there's an opportunity, which I would argue is the collapse of that civilizational cycle. There's normative flux. You've got there used to be a religious order that was normatively important. That's not there anymore. That creates a vacuum. So, what is it about that leads into that goes into that vacuum? And I want to talk about things such as the massive increase in bureaucratization, the evolutionary novelty, the change in the information environment, and the massive expansion of the universities, and in particular, a massive increase in the disciplines where the opportunity for intellectual prestige was very limited, but the opportunity to play dominance games through propriety for normative strategies became larger and larger and larger. Partly, and this is not an insignificant element, the feminization of education and the feminization of society generally, which I argue is different from equal rights for women, right? So how gender egalitarian your society is and how feminized its mores and outlooks and so forth are two different questions. In our lifetime, they're connected, but they needn't be. You can find societies which are relatively gender egalitarian, which aren't very feminized at all. And you can find societies which are very gender inegalitarian, yet go through phases of feminization where feminized outlooks and practices and so forth become more culturally dominant for whatever reason.
So what are like 2 or 3 characteristics of a feminized society?
Cliques replace teams.
Propriety
could replace cliques.
Yes.
Replace teams. Propriety dominates over prestige. And a shift away from vigor to what you might call prettiness in various forms, and even though it might not actually all that conventionally pretty, but a concern for how things feel and look, and a increased concern for propriety, and cliques replacing teams.
Okay, that's the cliques versus teams. Have you written that yet, or is that
not as a central? I referred to it in the Feminization as Consequences essays, but I haven't gone terribly deeply into it. I mean, the teams versus cliques things, that boys and tomboys form teams and girls and sissies form cliques. You can observe that in any schoolyard.
Yeah. Well, so are you familiar with Joyce Bennenson's?
Yes. Her Warriors and Warriors was one of the seminal books on my journey along this path, where I thought, yes, that makes so much sense.
Yeah. So teams and cliques is almost a simpler version of that. It's useful. So you have, I think one of your themes is the imagined future.
Yes.
And sort of when does that appear and why does that appear?
Yes. Okay. So Lindsay's right. You've got to go back to Hegel and Marx, right? And I agree with his, you start with Rousseau and his noble savage. You go to Kant and his separation of noumena and phenomena. Pardon, my pronunciations are always wrong. And then you go to Hegel, who was quite explicitly a Hermetic thinker. Brian McGee's completely correct on this. And Marx, who again I agree with Lindsay, Marx makes it a much more Gnostic view of the world, which is, we're imprisoned in an imprisoning reality and special knowledge will get us out, right? Which is Marxism in a nutshell. And so you get that stream of thought that develops and develops and develops and develops. I don't agree that it's all Marxism. I don't agree with Lindsay on that. I do agree that you get this underlying template that develops and develops and develops. And so what you've got is, with the Industrial Revolution, which really doesn't start until the 1820s, it really doesn't start until steam power is applied to transport, to railways and steamships.
Mm-hmm.
And from the 1820s on, you start being in a really new world. I mean, yes, you get the Great Enrichment, but all sorts of other things happen. You're separating households from production, which is what paid employment does, right? So households are created when we get to be sedentary. Nomadic foragers don't have households, they have families and hunting bands. When we get to be sedentary, whether sedentary foragers or sedentary farmers, or in a different sense, pastoralists, you get households. Households are both production and consumption units. That's the normal way things are arranged in those societies, right up until paid employment begins to be dominant, at which point you've separated production from households mostly, and you've got a situation where you've got men, and it's overwhelmingly men, going out to a shared workplace where they're paid in the same way and they socialize together, and neighborhood effects start retreating and more wider networks effects start retreating. So you get this, you are in a new world in so many ways. So you get the agitation for adult suffrage, for example. You'll get a much more urbanized society. So there's a whole lot of evolutionary novelty, social novelty going on. And it's obviously in a world where the future is likely visibly to be different, not a world where you can expect the past to be like the future. I mean, Ricardo and Smith are really describing societies where technological change hasn't really taken off yet. But, you know, then it does. And Marx is the first person who comes along and has, I hesitate to call it this, but in a sense, the theory of technological change, right? That this will transform society. So you've got this mixture of the working class is networking in a way that never did before. And in fact, in a sense, exists in a way it never did before, except as an urban fringe. And you've got this, the world is going to be a different place. The future is different because, and you get the first tech booms, for example, in I think the 1830s railway booms, I think the first proper tech boom, the tulip thing is different. And so you've got all these things going together, and you're getting the politics of mass trade and the politics of mass communication. So the free trade versus protectionist debate really doesn't take off until after the 1820s, because suddenly you're getting mass trade. So you can act, you know, depending on which of the three major factors of production is in scarcity, you get alliances between land, labor, and capital about trade in a way you never did before, because trade is now at a level which actually is impacting mass incomes, right? So you get, in Britain, they've got land is scarce, but labour is plentiful, they export it. Capital is plentiful, they export it. So labour and capital get together and impose free trade on land. In Germany, land is scarce and capital is scarce. They're importing capital. People don't realise how much the German Industrial Revolution was funded by British capital, but they're exporting labour. So capital and land get together and impose protection on labour. In the settler economies, they're importing labour, they're importing capital, that includes the United States, of course, and they're exporting the products of land. So labour and capital get together and impose protection on land. So this is, you get these, this is a pattern you didn't see before. It comes from mass transport, it comes from mass trade, you're getting mass communications, the politics of mass communications, and the world is a constantly changing place. So for a certain sort of activist come intellectual, the Marxist approach of, well, we can have this transformative future really begins to take off amongst them. Now, it doesn't fully take off until Lenin takes over the Russian Revolution, and suddenly you've got an example. But there's, nevertheless, Marxism is influenced, there's an intellectual network, there are small or large parties which are influenced by it, and it's building on this, the world is a new place, things are changing, we're getting new forms of politics. But the trouble with the transformative future is it's pure imagination. There is no reality test there. But it's rhetorically extremely powerful because it can be as perfect as you want it to be. So if you're defending something that's got history, it's going to have history. It's going to have bad things happen.
So I'd like to connect that with another writer. Are you familiar with Thomas Sowell?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I love Thomas Sowell.
So, I mean, he would describe that, and he would actually go back to the period, maybe a decade or two earlier, the late 18th century, divide where you have what he calls the division between the unconstrained vision and the constrained vision. And so your transformative future would be the unconstrained vision. And
correct, yes. Now that's a really interesting point, because a lot of these things that happen as a result of the application of steam power to transport in the 1820s and onwards are prefigured in the late Atlantic economy, right? So the Atlantic economy is North America and the Atlantic withdrawal and so forth, where there's no great technological shift as there was with steam engines, railways and steamships. But it's a case of quantity has a quality all of its own. There is such a huge increase in water transport, both in shipping and canals. There's a massive increase in the building of canals from the 17th century onwards, that you get a significant density of economic activity and trade, that you begin to shift more in what is going to be prefigured later. So the anti-slavery agitation in the United States, the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, which takes off in the late 18th century, is in fact really the first secular political agitation, right? It's the first mass politics in a sense. And so these things are stirring, which is why, you get Rousseau and you do get that anointed, as you say, unconstrained vision is beginning to turn up amongst intellectuals at that time, because the Enlightenment has given this space for thinking very seriously in a way that's not religious.
Okay.
Not explicitly religious.
Okay. So let's, jump forward to recently. Why would you say that the sort of woke thing has taken off so quickly? I mean, it seemed to, like, in the sort of, if you'd ask somebody at the end of the 1990s, they would say, well, there was this political correctness movement and it kind of died. And now it's, now people are afraid of it. So what's happened?
Okay, I think two things happened. A big thing is social media. What social media does, and particularly the way it evolves, is it really facilitated online mobbing, particularly by the motivated. And one thing, a friend of mine, Katie Barnett, who writes What Katie Did Substack and is a professor of philosophy, makes the really interesting point is when you see online mobs, particularly on Twitter, count the numbers. Because a lot of the time you'll find that it's actually a relatively small group of highly motivated people who are pushing this. But the thing is that online social media allows them to do that, which means what you can have is you can really, really push a really aggressive form of propriety. And to me, the sort of seminal moment is what's known as Shirtgate, which is November, I think, 2014. Now, people may remember this probably. There was a, I think, British scientist who'd supervised the really, really clever thing of landing a probe on a comet. Now, that's a really, really clever thing to do. It's a classic scientific, technological prestige thing to do. And the guy was publicly humiliated over his shirt, over the shirt he wore, right? So his prestige, which should have given him a great big tick, was swamped by this new, extremely intolerant propriety. And, without social media, it's very hard to see how that could have happened in that way. Okay. So that's part of it. And part of it is feminization reached a certain critical mass. So the way I would read political correctness, and that pattern that you identify, is you get the pill and legal abortion. Women can invest in their professional credentials way more than they could before. You get a wave of people, women, into various professions, including journalism. And the universities begin to feminize, and you've got the women's studies areas, which are almost completely feminized. And I would recommend the book Professing Feminism, which was written in 1994, which is all about this. Women's studies, and it's the dynamics. And it's replicating Joreen Friedman's essay of 1976, Trashing the Dark Side of the Sisterhood. It's the same patterns, but in academia, right? So you got the first wave of political correctness, which is a emotionally fearful, safety-seeking, very restrictive, very aggressive form of propriety. Mm-hmm. But the feminization hasn't reached a critical mass. So what you get is you get a pushback. The more masculinized prestige, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. People say, this is silly. We're supposed to be committed to free speech. This has got to go away. So you get a pushback, which is, successful for a while, but the underlying processes have kept going on. Right. So the feminization keeps going on, and then social media provides this really aggressive, it scales up essentially female aggression, or more precisely, it scales up reputational aggression, which is a classic form of female aggression because they're the physically weaker sex and they're bubs in tow, right? So physical aggression is a bad idea against people that are stronger than you. So you go for reputational aggression. The way reputational aggression works a lot of the time is it's very self-deceptive, right? You deceive yourself about your aggression. You put it in terms of morality and social concern.
Okay, so there does seem to be some pushback also happening now. Is it going to succeed or fail?
I don't know. My view is that prediction is fraught because there's always new information or things you weren't aware of. I much prefer to think of things in terms of scenarios. What scenarios I think is sort of implicit in the situation. I don't know which one of them has come true, but I can think of scenarios that will happen, right? So the way I would think of the scenarios here is, historically, when you got corrosive feminization, what would typically happen is some neighboring society where the male teams were performing just fine would come in and conquer the place. That would be the normal sort of pattern. That I don't think is at all likely. The West is so militarily dominant. I mean, so militarily dominant. I just don't think that's plausible. Russia's a joke. Islam has got so many problems. China has a lot more problems than people realize and is, seeking to become a regional hegemon, but it can't do more than that. So that option of the outside conquest doesn't seem to be likely, at least not for decades and decades and decades, so we can forget that one. The second possibility is we begin to have a much more adult conversation about the revolution, the evolutionary novelty we are in and what that means for us, including women are not pure forms of Homo sapiens. They have downsides. We're seeing some really negative patterns of female behavior. What are we going to do about that? So we have an adult conversation about that. Not a lot of signs of that are going on, but, we're in a position of enormous evolutionary novelty. It may happen. The third possibility is you just get the corroding effects continuing. And at some point you begin to get the collapse of complex systems and you get cascading failures, and that could be very, very bad indeed. The final possibility is basically men solve their coordination problem and they look around and they say, look, there's a whole lot of things that are not performing. We're being made the butt of everything. Everything's being blamed for it on us. It's all patriarchy, which is just a way of blaming men. The public discourse is very hostile. If you're a young man, the prospects aren't great. And your cultural position is not great. And men solve their coordination problem in some way, and men are the social solidarity sex and they're the physically stronger sex. And so you get a massive wind back of all sorts of social changes. I've got no idea about which of those will happen or in what degree, but
Okay.
yeah, those are the scenarios I can see.
Okay. So question, I want to gradually move the audience in here, but Elijah, did you prepare some questions or did some occur to you during this that you want to throw at us?
No, I don't have particular questions in mind, but I think John Palmer's question could be good to start with from the chat.
Okay. All right, John, you want to unmute and give us your question?
Well, the question is based on the Substack from Barry Weiss, in which she quoted Sam Peltzman's recent article. All I've seen is the abstract of the Peltzman article, but he's got some data from samples that go back to 1972, I think it is, showing that women have become increasingly unhappy, that over the past 5 to 10 years, men are becoming less unhappy, more happy, and there's been a divergence in the sexes, according to him. Now, Elijah said that that's not necessarily true about men, but the data that's Peltzman quoted suggests that there's been a divergence, and I wondered if that's related to the things that you're talking about with feminization of society. It seems to me that females have suddenly, over the past century, had to take on two roles, both nurturing and production, whereas men still mostly are involved in production. Oh yeah, we're supposed to be nurturing too, but it's not the same stress. And it seems to me there's a lot more stress on women to, I may be completely out to lunch on this, but it seems to me there's more stress on them. I see you nodding your head. I'm glad you seem to be nodding your head anyway.
Yeah, I agree. Yes. You're talking about the happiness data. And yes, it shows quite clearly that, now there are some problems with it, but we'll run with it. That women are not happier as a result of all these social changes as a group, and that comparatively men have been doing better despite a lot of the cultural issues going on. And I would absolutely agree. Now, there's a couple of things going on here. One is the male provider role has been lightened, right? So that's probably going to make men happier. Also, even though actual sexual activity has been going down, there are lots of other forms of cathartic relief which have become much more available, and I think that's tended to make men happier because they're mostly male-oriented cathartic release. And I don't only mean porn. I mean things like computer games, right? Which men enjoy a lot more than women. And a lot of men, obviously, and boys get a lot of pleasure and benefit out of them. So between the provider role has become less onerous, asterisks, I'll come back to that point in a minute, and there's much more ways for cathartic release which are much more masculine oriented. I'm not surprised that men have been doing better. Women, on the other hand, as you say, have got this extra bit later on. And one of my really big beefs with feminism is it tends to treat women as if they're ersatz men who are deformed by the possibility of pregnancy, which I think is just a bonkers way of thinking about women. And you're sort of designed to make them unhappy, right? Because, women and men are not cognitively the same. There's overlap. There's quite a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of non-overlap. And turning the feminist thing where anything men have, women have to have the same degree, functionally means, women are going to be ersatz men who are deformed by the possibility of pregnancy. That's just guaranteed to make them unhappy. Now, or more unhappy than they need to be. Now, I would point out that feminism, like all forms of activism, doesn't want its target group to be happy. Because if your target group is happy, you don't need the activists, right? So my classic example would be the Jewish lobby, which wants Jews to be as fearful as possible so they donate as much as possible to the Jewish lobby, right? And we're very, very good at self-deception. We're very good at rationalizing and moralizing our self-interest. And feminists are in the same situation. They don't want women to be happy because then you don't need feminists, right? So there's a real problem with bad incentives when you add our capacity for self-deception. I tend to be very hostile to activism because I see it as a way, as a bad incentives, but also attracts bad personalities, right? Because it's power without responsibility, where often you get lionized for behaving badly, and that's just catnip for the morally disordered. So a friend of mine used to work in Parliament House in Canberra, and she said there were some psychopaths, but not very many amongst the politicians, and there were some psychopaths, not very many about the staffers. But the group that was overrun with psychopaths was the activists and the lobbyists. And because it's power without responsibility, and you're lionized for behaving badly, so it attracts the morally disordered, which is, you know, really, and it's got bad incentives. See Hoffa's The True Believer, right? So yes, so I think that's a really big part of what's going on, and that indeed the happiness data I'm aware of, very well aware of, and I'm actually not surprised. And there's a writer on Substack, Alice Evans, who some ways I really like because she believes in data and she believes in big data and immerses herself and makes intelligent comments about it. But she does suffer from the feminist perspective a bit, where she talks about things like motherhood penalty. And I'm always dubious about when people talk about the motherhood penalty, because it looks to me like you're going back to women are urged at men who are deformed by the possibility of pregnancy, but also because it devalues motherhood. One of the problems, I think, in working class families is motherhood is such a powerful factor in parenting that unless the men can bring something that balances that, it becomes much harder to maintain stable marriages. And if men have no income advantage, and if you don't have kids, they don't anymore, and if they don't have any other advantages, and working class men generally don't, then it's much harder for them to balance out motherhood. And so you're getting the collapse in family structures that you're getting, which is concentrated very much at the lower half of society, because then you've got men who have got less to offer. Men in the top half of society have things like connections that they can offer and bring in. Broad connections rather than just local connections. With things going to, in the work class case, the men's connections and the women's connections are going to be very similar. So there's not the benefit. But if you're a professional, you've got your own connections. Your wife, if she's a professional, got her connections. You can mesh them together. You're offering her a lot more, right? And so that issue of what are men offering, and to balance out motherhood, when women are now in a situation where they're earning income and being mothers, so they're under extra stress, and that, and what's the man offering that, I can't get myself because I can get access to income. There's a real issue there. Now, my asterisk about the provider is we are still in a situation of men as providers, but we're just lying about it. And the way we lie about it is through the welfare state. If you look at the welfare state, on the occasions you can get aggregate figures, it's mostly a transfer from men to women. That men pay far more into the welfare state than they receive in aggregate, and women receive in aggregate from the welfare state more than they pay.
Are you going to have? Sorry, are you going to have that make that point in one of the essays in your sequence?
Yes, or else if I don't, I'll make it on my own Substack. So I have my own Substack where I sometimes do shorter essays which are riffing off what's the longer pieces on Helen Dale's Substack. Mm-hmm. But yes, I've got a New Zealand study, which is the only one I've come across, but I gather there are also British figures which I'm trying to track down. New Zealand may be a slightly extreme case, but according to the New Zealand data, there's about 5 years where women are net contributors to the welfare state, and for the rest of their lives, they're net recipients, on average.
All right, I'd like to bring the audience in, and so if you have a question, I guess raise the virtual hand, as it were. So let's start with Tom.
Yeah, hi,
Yes.
Lorenzo. It's nice
Hi.
to hear you. On the women who are deformed by pregnancy, I think that that's one issue that feminism has failed to support those women who choose to be mothers. But similarly, there's the idea of women wanting to be equally promiscuous as men. And this was, if you think at Cary Grant in the movies or John F. Kennedy, who we find out was far more active in cheating on Jackie than the media proclaimed, or Clinton or Trump. And one of the issues that you brought up at the very beginning is how fast that happened. And I think that you could have maybe thought about how TV and the movies have allowed um, the entertainment companies to monetize sexual promiscuity. And all of the movies that have unmarried people either explicitly or implicitly having sex is part of this monetization of promiscuity. And the way I look at it is that love is both lust and commitment, but the lust is very photogenic, but the commitment is not. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, nice point. Now, but I wouldn't give the movies and TV a driving role here. I would give it a reinforcing role. So I think it intensifies the change, but I don't think it creates the change, because you look at movies in the 40s and 50s, they're still playing to the commitment game, right? Cary Grant teaches you how to be a gentleman. In fact, you could reasonably argue that the net effects of the movies was to intensify better behavior by men. That you wanted to be Cary Grant, you didn't want to be a cad, right? But once the shift happens, then absolutely, films and TV are intensifying the shift. And part of the reason why they're doing that is, as you say, much more photogenic, but also because Hollywood's run by extremely wealthy people, and they show the patterns of wealthy elites. And wealthy elites have never been very good at keeping to this rule, right? The English aristocracy was notoriously bad at keeping to this rule. And I mean, there's one duchess whose children were known as I can't remember what she was the Duchess of, Bedford, I think, the Bedford Miscellany, because everyone knew that her various children had different fathers, right? Right. The heir was clearly the Duke's son, and everyone was cool with that. But, and so that's the 18th century, right? So this combination of it's wealthy people behaving like wealthy people have done for a very long time, intensifying patterns that are turning up in the society. Now, Hollywood was a sort of bit of a sexual cesspit in the 30s, but the films didn't reflect that, did they? Because that wouldn't resonate with the audience. But once you start getting this social change,
and there were,
it resonates.
Right, and there was the code in Hollywood.
Yes.
Yeah, Elijah, do you have a virtual hand up? You want to...
Yeah. One thing that stuck with me from Albion Seed is talking about the Virginia elites and just how much promiscuity there was. It was really striking. Like George Washington even had some, act like promiscuous acts, but he was basically like the most non-promiscuous you could possibly imagine for someone of his status. Thomas Jefferson was had a lot of promiscuity, but still kind of tempered to some extent. And then he looks at the typical elites, or maybe typical to more extreme cases, and it's just nonstop.
Yeah.
So that's really striking. I wonder. I think I lost a little bit my question, but it reminds me of Robin Hanson's idea of status drunkenness, and basically the idea that in the modern age, as we've progressed further and further into modernity, more and more people are kind of deceived into thinking that they're high status, or they think of themselves as rich, and so they start behaving in in ways that don't actually, they're not even necessarily well adapted to their situation. They might even cause them active harm, but because, because we're so aware of what high status people do through movies, television, and, especially social media, and also because we're just objectively wealthier than we've been in the past, people start becoming more promiscuous, less religious, less, less, kind of community oriented in traditional ways or local ways. What are your thoughts on kind of that?
Yeah, I would
maybe?
basically agree. I mean, his point about we're moving away from farmer habits to forager habits, I think has a lot to do with it, with what's happening. And part of what's going on there is, as you say, we see how other people appear to live, and a lot of it is how they appear to live, and some of it is how they actually live. And we see that, and we are much less locally connected than we used to be. Now, this varies enormously by the level of society, right? So hence, Goodhart's distinction between anywheres and somewheres is very, very important. Once you've seen that distinction, it's very hard to unsee it, and you begin to realize it's a distinction that goes way, way back in history. So if you think about, past aristocracies as anywheres ruling a whole lot of somewheres, then you think, yeah, this is a pattern that's got lots and lots of history to it. And of course, our evidence of the past mainly comes from the anywheres and comes from the somewheres much less. So, and in our situation, the way the somewheres are, even now, are still very much more invested in local connections than the anywheres are, is, I think, one of the really big divides in society. So going back to that point about status drunk, but even amongst our somewheres, neighbourhood effects are much weaker than they used to be. Online effects are much stronger, of sort of that public information, which is targeted to getting an emotional response out of you, is much stronger. And we are in a position of enormous evolutionary and social novelty. So it becomes less clear what your social strategy should be. And so you get a lot more exploration at all sorts of levels, and a lot of these don't work, but it takes quite a long time for them to realize that they don't work, or they don't work as well as you would like. So yes, I think there's a mixture of confusing signals and novelty and all that's going on all at the same time. And so yes, I would agree with Hanson's point that I like status drunkenness. That's a good phrase. I hadn't come across it. But yes, I would agree that a lot of that's what's going on. And remembering that Niall Ferguson's point that new information technologies can be enormously socially disruptive. So his point about the printing press, it leads to the scientific revolution, but it also leads to the Reformation and wars of religion. And he can make some very frightening analogies between the effect of the printing press and the effect of the internet, and how the internet effect is way, way quicker.
Yeah.
Way quicker.
Yeah. So Elijah, you have another one?
Yeah, I just you mentioned confusing signals, and this was something I was thinking about when you were talking earlier. I wonder whether one potentially confusing signal in kind of a dual income household is the fact that men on average take more risks in their careers. And so maybe in expected value terms, you have men who are doing a lot, maybe they're doing more than is recognized to provide, but then the realization, of course, is often going to be below the expected value. And that could potentially make it a lot easier to feel like they're not pulling their weight, perhaps.
Yes, it is the classic male outcomes are more varied than female outcomes, and that just shows that manifests across a whole lot of stuff. Partly due because male characteristics have a flatter bell curve than female characteristics, for reasons that go back to evolutionary pressures. But yes, I think that's true. And in a situation of a great deal of novelty, where people, in a sense, we are in a situation where a small number of people can score really, really well, and a large number of people can trip over because of the level of novelty we're in. So I think that's a very good point.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it's probably we've extracted a lot from you. You're quite the autodidact. I don't think I mentioned any book that you hadn't read.
Or at least I was aware of, yes.
You know, and
Well, what about the Mind Club? I think the Mind Club would be fitting in here. And maybe he hasn't read it, but I think that the feminization is also involved in humans as agents, or as humans as victims, sort of. And I think that there's a desire to have binary thinking when in fact everybody is both.
Yes. And the difference is what, one group's more than the other, but they're not. It's not either or in that binary sense. Yes, the cognitive difference between men and women is surprisingly high, though. About 70% of men have a pattern of personality traits that no woman has, and conversely, 70% of women have a pattern of personality traits that no men have. Now, to be fair, it only takes one of the 15 dimensions of personality traits to be outside the other sexes to be different. So that may in some ways overstate it, but that's still a fairly high level of cognitive dimorphism. In fact, in one of my essays, I have a theory about human homosexuality that comes out of that cognitive dimorphism. So yes, that book I'm not aware of.
Good. All right. Okay, I'm going to just tell somebody. Hang on. No, I think so. Somebody wants to be admitted to the room, but I think I'm just going to not do it because I think we're done. And I want to say thank you very much. This has been a very enjoyable conversation.
And I would really plug Helen Dale's Substack, partly because that's where my Worshipping the Future essays are on, but of course Helen has massively expanded my audience, and she's a very accomplished writer in her own right, and has her own essays and occasionally essays from other writers. So Helen Dale's Substack, which is not on your team, I really want to recommend people have a look at that.
Okay. Sorry, we have maybe one last thing. Bill, you have a quick question? You have to unmute if you're going to ask it.
I was just going to ask,
yeah.
different.
Wait, just a second. Susan, do you have a quick question?
Yeah, a key difference to me in terms of the changes we were talking about in society, why the student revolution, so to speak, petered out, political correctness became a fact, but not an active fact, is what I notice now is the bureaucratization or the seeping of this entire mindset into education. It's right through schools. It is right through materials which are taught to students in schools. It's right through and entrenched in the bureaucracies now, which seems to me a good step further from what it was in the past.
Yes. And of course, bureaucracies, because they're all about processes, an aggressive form of propriety really scores in bureaucracies because they are all about processes. And part of what's going on, I think, is that the popularization of critical theory evolved in a way that really targeted bureaucratic pathologies and then proceeds to make those pathologies worse. And so as you get bureaucratization, yes, because that's what this stuff is very well targeted to play to. And you get, and it makes the bureaucracy less functional because it's targeted at their pathologies, not at their functionality.
Yeah, well, yeah, relates to the piece by N.S. Lyons. Do you follow his stuff? Yeah. So
Yes, I do.
relates to-
Yes, yes.
yeah, that piece. Bill, you want to?
Yes. My question here is, when might we see the essays in the book form? And have you considered possibly self-publishing the way Martin Gurry first did on Amazon?
Yes. Well, we won't set in book form until I've finished the essays. They're all in at least draft form except one, but they get reworked before they get published because, you know, I've got feedback, things have happened, I've made notes which I've added to them that need to be incorporated. So we're about 2/3 of the way through. And the schedule has been one a week so far, more or less. One a week has been the normal pattern. So it'll take until that's completed. So, you know, it's not going to be a book before the end of the year, I can tell you that. On the other hand, yes, self-publishing. Now, Helen, I have to say, who's been my editor and my publisher on Substack, is not keen on self-publication because she's going to get published through serious publishers.
Yeah, I agree with that,
she's-
by the way.
that
The advantage of the challenge of self-publishing is getting any kind of publicity. And I don't know, one place you might consider marketing to, I don't know, they may or might not touch it at this point, is the one that did publish Martin Gurry, Stripe Press. And if you don't know, or Helen doesn't know how to get a hold of them, I can probably
thank you very much. We'll keep that in mind. Yes. Helen has, of course, she's a published author,
right?
Has her own connections too. So we'll see what plays out.
Yeah.
But thank you very much for that suggestion.
Okay. All right. Okay. I think I'm going to end this. And again, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Very enjoyable conversation. All right.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.